All right, well, just after a day of taking the kudos for reducing inflation, albeit it's a temporary reduction, says the RBA, because of those taxpayer energy payments, the Treasurer dashed off to Beijing for meetings. Now, only weeks ago, China announced it would slowly raise the retirement age of the next 15 years to prevent its pension funds from running dry. And the Chinese central bank's also unveiled an unprecedented economic policy blitz aimed at stimulating growth. For more on this now, I'm joined by former finance writer, now media writer at the Australian, Sophie Elsworth, and the Deputy Executive Director of the Institute of Public Affairs, Daniel Wild. Sophie, given how important China's terms of trade have been to our prosperity, economic uncertainty there, as this a continuing inflation risk pays out here. I mean, the RBA says we're not out of the woods. 2026, they say, before things stabilise. You know, Labor's only months out from an election. They've got to be pretty worried.
Of course they will be, Peter, but I think this is important for many reasons. China are a big trade partner of ours, and obviously we still have those sanctions with lobsters, which is really important here. But there are still issues that need to be resolved between Australia and China. But I do think that the Labor government has helped improve those relations because, as we know, it was pretty hostile when the Morrison government was in power. So hopefully some good comes out of these meetings.
Daniel, I quoted extensively from an article that he's put out, former ALP State Secretary, Sky News commentator Cameron Milner, saying that federal Labor's in a death spiral of its own making. And it's time for Albanese, he says, to either step aside or be removed. Now, these revelations this week that Treasury is looking at changes to negative gearing, which means the government is, I mean, don't pull the wool over our eyes. You and I both know exactly what's going on here. This is setting up a bit of a power play, and I reckon it looks a lot like what happened on the Stage 3 tax cuts.
Well, I think that's right, Peter. Cameron Milner certainly didn't miss it, did he, in his article? And he's a very astute observer, I think, of the Australian political landscape. It's really been the amazing shrinking Albanese since the Voice to Parliament defeat. I think we'll look back on that not only as a great victory as we head to the one-year anniversary for the Australian way of life and a reinforcement of equality, but also as the nail in the coffin of the government and potentially of the Prime Minister Albanese. The speech that he gave on that night, on referendum night, was one of the worst political speeches I've ever seen. He didn't take responsibility. He blamed two things. He blamed misinformation and he blamed Peter Dutton for why Australians voted no. And things have only got worse since then. As we've talked about, Peter, this is not a government that is looking out for the nation. It's a sectional government, not a national government. It's more of a Whitlam government, not a Hawke government. And it's a redistributionist government, not a growth government. And so I think the Prime Minister has failed to bring the nation with him. We're seeing this with a negative gearing proposed, potential changes, which is really just an attack on aspirational mainstream Australians who want financial security and they want to be able to get ahead. They want upward economic mobility for themselves and their family. So these aren't the top end of town. These are coppers, teachers, nurses and so on that have an investment property. Now, yes, if you've got 10 of them that are negatively geared, that should be looked at. But when we're looking at one negatively geared property, this is really just an attack on aspirational Australians.
Absolutely. It's a Marxist philosophy. And you've got to add in there not just Whitlam, but Rudd, says Michael Costa. I mean, that's about as bad as it can get. Last night, ABC Chair Kim Williams delivered the keynote address at the Lowy Institute Media Award dinner. This is a little of what he had to say.
The world is in the middle of a crisis of mistrust of information. Our devices are awash with this fake news. People are on edge about what is real. And it is producing a radical mistrust of mainstream news sources too.
Sophie, give me a break. Fake news coming from the chair of the ABC when we know that they doctored footage about a war crimes investigation involving one of our own who wears our uniform. And we've got no answers from this.
Well, we certainly don't have any answers, Peter, and the investigation is underway. But it is interesting that the ABC Managing Director, David Anderson, has previously said he will not apologise to former soldier Heston Russell. And the ABC can take an awfully long time to hold these investigations. This could be months, could be years in the making, and it is a shocking mistake, a shocking error, and one that the ABC, it's absolutely damaged them, and one that they need to rectify pretty quickly, because this is where the public loses trust in them. You
are not wrong. The Administrative Appeals Tribunal, our court system too, reportedly set to be inundated with appeals from international students looking to overturn their cancelled or denied visa status. The Australian reports the AAT's already been swamped with applications to review their visas. Now, this can take years. This is run through the courts. It often ends up in the federal court after the AAT, as you know, Daniel. I tell you, it begs the question, how does someone here on a temporary visa or sitting in India or wherever it might be trying to get a visa to come to Australia, if we say no, how do they get to use our legal system to try and second guess a decision of government?
Well, our migration program is a joke, Peter. The government's not in control of it. I mean, basically, universities set our migration program. They've had carte blanche for a number of years with no cap on the number of students they can bring in. Now, I will give the Education Minister, Jason Clare, some credit for imposing a cap. I'm not convinced it's going to have much of an impact, by the way, but, you know, credit where it's due. But it just goes to this bigger issue. We have this unprecedented surge to migration, the biggest surge in our nation's population in our history. And there's all these backdoor ways now that we're finding that the cap that the government has said they're going to put on can basically be circumvented through these visas being challenged in the court system. It's going to get bogged down, as you say. And I think it's just another example. If you're a mainstream Australian out there, you are getting poorer. You are getting poorer every single month that goes by, in large part because of this unplanned mass migration program. Now, we all want to be a welcoming and tolerant nation and to have a well-planned, managed program that is in our national interest. But I've got to say, since day one of this government, the program has been uncontrolled, sending our nation backwards. And I think this is just another example of a failed program.
I mean, Sophie, we can't send the foreign criminals home. We're stuck with them in Australia. We've got them out of detention in the community. The government's not even monitoring them. These students, many of them are not here. Those that are here are only here temporarily. And we can't even as a government or as a country say, sorry, we've changed our mind, we're cutting these numbers back, we want you to go home. And we're going to pay for it, as we know, Australians, going through the court system, dealing with this, taxpayer-funded legal cases. I mean, I think it's outrageous.
Well, Peter, this is obviously a very important point of difference for Peter Dutton, and one that I think he can win many votes by, because Labor always runs scared when it comes to these issues, and they try and divert away from it. So I think if he can prosecute this point in the run-up to the next election, it could do him some favours at the polling booths.